Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 50, 5 Kings and Some Romans. Today is a day for getting a move on, putting on the afterburners, and getting the let out. I left you all on a down note last time, as Visigothic was murdered after a failed attempt to undo his deposition by Theodoric the Great. Today is about the next 50 years or so of high politics in the Visigothic kingdom, and by high politics, I mostly mean war. Is anyone surprised? Really? We'll start with the regency period of Theodoric on behalf of his grandson, and how that all worked in practice as far as we can tell. Once that odd period is over, the Visigoths suddenly find themselves running low on royals, and instability was the result. Instability, as it often does, attracted the attention of outside powers, in this case Franks, and a little later on, Romans. Not to spoil anything, but when we end today, the long arm of Justinian's restorationist ambitions will have reached all the way across the sea to land lightly but firmly on the sunny beaches of Hispania. There will be war, there will be chaos, and I'm very sorry to say there will be names. Some familiar, Theodoric and Justinian, and a surprise guest that I will not mention here. And there will be a new crop of Gothic names. The good news is that just like the names of the Suevic kings I talked about a couple episodes back, I doubt many of them will come up ever again. Harsh, but true. So you don't have to worry about seeing them on the test. A shortish episode ultimately, but a packed one. So if you have taken a deep breath, we can take the plunge. When we left off last time, Visigothic, the oldest son of the unfortunate Alaric II, had made a last-ditch effort to make a comeback, looking for support among the remaining Goths of southern Gaul and coming up short. Nominally, Theodoric's grandson Amalaric was king, but while he was a minor, Theodoric set himself up as a regent, and so directly or indirectly ruled a swathe of territory that stretched from Portugal to Croatia. Now, I hear you thinking, hang on a second. Before you go on, Goths of southern Gaul, I thought that they were all turfed out by the Franks after 507. Well, yes and no. Whenever I say so-and-so were driven out from such and such, it helps to keep in your mind that what I usually mean is that the elites and nobility of so-and-so have been forced out. Just like we've talked about in regard to the existing Roman populations, the effort involved in an actual wholesale replacement of a group with another group is far beyond the reach of any of the kings that we've talked about. Plus, it would be counterproductive. You need someone to manage the harvests and such, and who is going to pay for your taxes and support your army? So the king and his followers were creamed off and forced over the mountains, but there were still plenty of Goths in Aquitaine and the Auvergne, and it actually took the Franks a decade or two to really make their conquest of the region stick permanently. And that's the reality of the history we're talking about. We have been presented with big blocks of color moving around on maps, and it is very easy to forget that those blocks are all made up of thousands of individual little dots that make their own choices. Whether they all stay together with the rest of the red pieces as they move over, or stay put and try to stay red while the blue pieces move in, or to change from red dots to blue dots, and it just in the hope of a peaceful life. But I babble. Let's get back to Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogoth who had pushed out the illegitimate Visigothic dot, and now ruled on behalf of his grandson, the young Amalaric. Alas, it is almost impossible to know the exact nature of Theodoric's regency in Hispania, and even more difficult to know how the Visigoths felt about it. All the evidence we have is circumstantial, straw in the wind. To begin with are two ecumenical councils that are recorded, one in Tarragona in 515 and one in Gerona in 516, which in their official minutes are dated according to the regnal year of Theodoric, which would suggest that A, Theodoric was ruling directly, not as a regent, and B, that he had begun doing so in 511 immediately after Visigothic was deposed. Tribute was certainly being sent to Ravenna as well. Historian Herwig Wolfram is unequivocal about the situation, writing that Theodoric did not merely want to save the Visigothic kingdom, he wanted to gain control over it for himself. Set against that, there's little real evidence for Ostrogothic occupation of Hispania or Septimania, and Theodoric's rule seems to have been fairly lightly applied, through appointed governors who worked mostly with local military powers. There were Ostrogothic military forces in Hispania, but never very many. We have the presence of a governor or a viceroy by the name of Theudas, who seems to have been appointed by Theodoric and who demonstrated a fairly wide streak of independence. For example, at one point he refused a summons from Theodoric to come to Ravenna, and Theodoric thought that he couldn't really pursue the issue, and that making a big deal out of it might lead to rebellion from the Visigoths or invasion by the Franks, so he let it drop. Theudas is a name that you should remember, because he will be coming back shortly. By 522, Amalaric was 20 years old and ready to take direct control of his territories. Tribute payments to Italy apparently ceased no later than 523. If Theodoric had ever considered Hispania part of a reinvigorated empire, he wasn't prepared to usurp the rights of his grandson to make it happen. Relations between the two Gothic halves remained cordial, and, given the continued threat of Frankish and Burgundian aggression, that was good for both of them. According to Isidore, Theodoric gave the kingdom to Amalaric just prior to his death. He doesn't give us a date, but the Second Council of Toledo in 527 convened in the 5th year of Amalric's reign, so 522 is our logical conclusion. Such is the documentary detective work that historians have to do in the pursuit of light, truth, and a coherent chronology. Theodoric still exercised influence over events in Hispania, but after his death in 526, none of his successors had the wherewithal to continue to do so, and Amalaric was then completely independent. Pretty much nothing is recorded of Amalaric's activities as king. Amalaric married a Frankish princess named Crotilda, who, being a Frank, was a Catholic Christian. She was unwilling to convert to the Arian faith, and for this reason, Amalaric began to abuse her. In distress, she wrote to her brother, who happened to be the Frankish king Childebert. Childebert attacked Septimania and defeated Amalaric at Narbonne, and in a spooky reiteration of Gisalic's fate, Amalaric fled to Barcelona, where he was caught and murdered while on his way to the church in search of refuge. That story comes mostly from Gregory of Tours, who is absolutely committed to promoting the cause of Catholic Christianity, and so may be exaggerating the spousal abuse story. He reports that Crotilda sent her brother a towel soaked in her own blood as evidence of the severity of Amalaric's crime, which I suppose is entirely possible, and if so, gross, but also the kind of embroidery that I kind of have come to expect from Gregory. The equally Catholic Isidore of Seville doesn't mention Amalaric's wife at all. In the relevant entry in his chronicle, he wrote, "He ruled for 5 years, but when he had been overcome in battle at Narbonne by Childebert of the Franks, he fled in fear to Barcelona, and having been made contemptible in the sight of all, he was executed by his army that had come from Narbonne and perished in the Forum." I'm fairly certain that it is, in fact, Amalaric that perished in the Forum, not the army. Anyway, again, we are back to the shame of cowardice. This, by the way, is the only mention that Amalaric gets in Isidore's chronicle beyond what I've already told you about Theodoric. Regardless of Amalaric's marital problems, we can be reasonably sure that there was ongoing trouble with the Franks to the north. Maybe Amalaric was attempting to ease these tensions with that marriage to the king's sister, but it doesn't seem to have helped. Under Theodoric's protection, the Visigoths were able to push their borders back a bit into Gaul, maybe even briefly as far as Toulouse, but in the long run that just encouraged raiding and instability along the border. Maybe it was one of these raids that led to Amalaric's death. Childebert, by the way, was the third of Clovis's 4 sons, and had made himself king of Paris, and participated fully in the early Merovingian games of fratricide and plotting, which I will save for another time, although I have already told you of the conspiracy he and 2 of his brothers undertook to murder their nephews upon the death of their father, back in episode 37, The Magical History Tour. But that's for another time. Whether Amalaric was killed by raiding Franks or by his own men, disgusted at his cowardice, his death marked the end of the dynasty that claimed descent back to Alaric I and beyond. He was about 29 years old, and depending on your reckoning, had been king of the Visigoths for either 5 or 9 years. What to do now? The tradition was that the most competent and promising member of the ruling dynasty would be chosen as king, and now there was no ruling dynasty left to choose from. We've seen this happen before in the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, when Theodahad, the last of the Amals, was overthrown and killed. Or will be overthrown and killed, since in the timeline we are currently following, that won't happen for another 5 years or so. In the absence of a member of the Balt dynasty, the Visigothic nobility looked around and wondered. It would have to be someone with both military and administrative experience, someone they could trust, someone who would be impartial and could settle disputes among the noble families without being accused of favor. And their eyes fell on Theudas, the governor/viceroy, or whatever, that Theodoric had sent at the beginning of Amalric's reign. Theudas was married to a woman from an old Hispano-Roman family, so he could maybe bridge the divide between those two societies. He had been a successful commander both in the army of Theodoric and leading Visigothic troops against the Franks. But he had no army of his own that they needed to worry about as an instrument of tyranny. Apparently the core of his military following were actually slaves that belonged to his wife. Like the Visigothic nobles, he was an Arian Christian and of high birth, but that nobility was mostly on the Italian side of the ledger, which set him apart from the Visigothic politics and family feuding. The more they thought about it, the better the choice seemed, and so Theudas was elected king. Wolfram, again, adds the possibility that Ostrogothic nobles that had come with Theudas upon his appointment may have helped swing the thing in his favor, though given everything I just went through, I'm not sure that's necessary to explain his selection. Taking stock of his new kingdom, Theudas can't have been overly optimistic. Though we don't have a blow-by-blow listing, it's clear that the Franks had been raiding into Visigoth territory more or less continuously since Vuil. It's hard to set up housekeeping in a new place when the neighbors keep breaking your windows. The early years also brought with them increased interest from Constantinople. Theudas received word in 533, just 2 years after his election, that the Vandals had been defeated at the Battle of Ad Decimum, and that Carthage had fallen to Belisarius. He received that news right before Vandal ambassadors arrived to ask for his help, and he rather cruelly strung them along, declining an alliance and then advising them to head to the sea coast, for from there you will learn of affairs at home with certainty. The ambassadors did return to Carthage and were duly captured by the Byzantines. The fall of Vandal Africa was a worry to Theudas, since trade connections between Africa and Hispania were close, and each could be seen as a gateway to the other. But every problem is also an opportunity, and Theudas took the Vandals' misfortune as a chance to grab the prosperous and strategically important port at Ceuta, on the African side of the Strait of Gibraltar. That kind of initiative probably helped his standing among the Gothic nobility. Theudas also got pretty good press from the Catholic chroniclers, since even though he was personally an Arian, he made no moves against the Catholic community. He also approved and supported 3 ecclesiastical councils in his provinces, 1 in 540 and 2 in 546, which was noted approvingly by Isidore of Seville. Maybe his marriage to a wealthy Roman woman helped in this regard. And in 541, a large Frankish army penetrated deep into Terra Cannensis and laid siege to Zaragoza. The army was apparently a joint command of 2 Merovingian kings, Childebert, who we've already met, and his younger brother Clothar, the king of Soissons. Clothar was the most driven of Clovis's sons, constantly fighting to expand his territories. His brothers more or less went along with his schemes, mostly to avoid becoming one of his targets, and his attack into Hispania was probably such a campaign. The outcome is unclear, as there are 2 widely divergent stories. Isidore of Seville reports that a Visigothic general named Theodogisel attacked the Franks as they besieged Zaragoza. He took bribes from some of them to allow them to escape, and the rest he fought and massacred down to the last man. On the other hand, Gregory of Tours reports that the Franks conquered much Spanish territory and returned laden with treasure. Gregory, as we know, is generally on the Frankish side, but actually the 2 stories aren't mutually exclusive. The Franks seem to have been successful up until they reached Zaragoza, and the men who did return probably did return quite a bit richer. So it may be the case of Gregory simply leaving out the details in the name of spin. If we accept Isidore's account, then here we have the first recorded instance of the Visigoths successfully fighting off a large-scale Frankish aggression since Vuil. Theudas is the first Visigothic king that has had any kind of aura of success since Theodoric II, and in 546 he ticked off another box on the Good King list by issuing a code of laws. I am planning an episode to go into the state of law in the post-Roman age in a little bit, and I will talk more about Theudas' code then. But just nota bene, Theudas is right there with Theodoric in trying to bring some order to the post-Roman chaos. Theudas' end, though, will also sound familiar, if you think back along the line of Visigothic kings. Let's hear it from Isidore. He was wounded by someone in the palace who had feigned the appearance of a demented person in order to deceive the king. He feigned insanity through skill and stabbed the king, who, after being laid low by this wound, fell, and breathed out his soul by the force of the sword. Murder in the palace. If we take a census of every Visigothic king going back to Alaric I, we will find that out of the 11 kings we've talked about, 6 of them have been murdered, and 2 have died in battle. Only Alaric I, Wallia, and Euric have managed to die in bed. And now Theudas, proving that not being of the Balt dynasty was no protection. The actual reasons for the assassination are unrecorded, of course, and we are forced to speculate. Most likely, this is probably the result of a blood feud, which is neat, since it will nest very comfortably alongside that discussion of law that I've got simmering. We have seen kings laid low by blood feuds before, notably Ataulf, murdered by Sigaric way back when, who was in turn then taken out by Wallia. Theudas' connection to the Ostrogothic elite only widened the pool of potential assassins. Family honor was a deadly serious concept among the Goths, and a man might pay with his life for a relative's transgressions. Best not to speculate too far about what specific act might have motivated Theudas' killer. He was a king. It's impossible to be a king without making enemies. If it was an honor killing, though, Theudas broke the cycle of vengeance with his dying breath. According to Isidore, as he was pouring out his life onto the floor, Theudas called that his assailant should not be killed, for he had already punished himself by depriving himself of a leader, which somehow manages to be both generous and haughty at the same time. Theudas was in his late 60s when he died, pretty good, and had been a relatively successful king of the Visigoths for 17 years. So now a new generation of Visigoths faced the same problem they'd faced when Amalaric had died, an empty throne and no established dynasty from which to pick a successor. If Theudas had any children, they are not mentioned and must have been unacceptable in some way. Maybe they were just back in Italy. While their dynasty had failed, there was at least still a dynasty available, though it was another imported one. The general who had driven the Franks away from Zaragoza, Theodogisel, had powerful relations, and he was the son of Theodahad, the king of the Ostrogoths and murderer of Amalasuentha, and that made Theodogisel a grandnephew of Theodoric the Great, I think. A man with a noble pedigree and proven success in battle. Here we are again. The election of Theodogisel must have seemed like a cakewalk, and we are already halfway through all the information I have about him. The Visigoths came to regret their choice almost immediately. Isidore accuses Theodogisel of serial adultery with the wives of his great men, by public prostitution, whatever that means. Unwilling to tolerate such goings-on and worried that the king might become murderous if he was called out on his behavior, the nobility threw a banquet, where the wayward king was extinguished by stabbing. Theodogisel was probably 48 or 49 when he was killed in 548, and he had been king for about 19 months. I personally am happy for him to have had such a short run, since Theodogisel is a vicious name to have to pronounce. I have found the alternative pronunciation Theodoselo in a couple of Spanish sources, but I'm not sure that's any better. The next few years were a confused muddle, as something like open civil war now broke out among the Gothic nobility, with each family saying that there was absolutely no reason that they couldn't be the ruling dynasty. The traditional dynasties were spent, so it was time to make a new tradition. By the way, if you want to visualize the kind of fighting that's taking place among all of this rancor, you could do worse than to re-watch The Lord of the Rings, which is actually always a good idea. The Rohirrim, the horse lords of Rohan, aesthetically are largely based on Gothic designs as far as I understand. Don't get picky about specifics, there's all kinds of Northern European stuff going on in there. But the Goths were a cavalry force, and the general style of armor and some decoration matches up pretty okay. The primary contenders to emerge from these internal disputes were two, Agila and Athanagild. Agila apparently came to prominence first, if we follow Isidore's chronology. There are three key events in the struggle between these two. A rebellion in Cordoba against Agila, a second rebellion headed by Athanagild against Agila, and based in Seville, and subsequently a call for help to Justinian, which led to the Byzantines occupying the southern coast of Hispania for the next 100 years or so. In Isidore's version, it was Athanagild that called for imperial support in overthrowing Agila. But the timeline is confused and we can't be sure of the order these things take place in. Historian Roger Collins suggests that Agila did indeed declare himself king of the Visigoths in 548 or 9, and then had to fight to make it stick. The so-called uprising in Cordoba may have been more like a battle in a civil war than a squishing of a rebellion against an established monarch. Likewise, the following rebellion of Athanagild may have been less rebellion and more of a refusal to recognize a grab for power. Two powerful nobles and their followers in a simple contest of wills to force the other into submission. The two strong men apparently found themselves more or less equally matched and looked to outside help for advantage. According to Isidore, it was Athanagild who reached out to Justinian. In every other intervention we have seen, Justinian's casus belli has been to correct an unjust or unlawful usurpation of a sitting ruler. We saw it in both Africa and in Italy, so it would be a bit against type for Justinian to step in favor of a usurper if that's what Athanagild was. For once, Jordanes may be a more reliable source. At the very tail end of his History of the Goths, almost as an aside, he notes that Agila holds the kingdom to the present day, and that Athanagild has rebelled against him and is even now provoking the might of the Roman Empire. It seems much more likely that contra in Isidore, it was Agila that called to help against Athanagild. Jordanes by this point is pretty much writing about current events, as evidenced by the present tense. And by the way, guess who Justinian tapped to command this expedition to sunny Spain? Nope, not Belisarius. It was Count Liberius, the same Liberius who had served both Odoacer and Theodoric in Italy and in Gaul, slid smoothly over into imperial service when it became clear that war was coming on Belisarius' ships, and who had served the emperor in Egypt for quite a while. Now well into his 80s, we find Liberius leading a small contingent of 2,000 men to intervene in the Gothic troubles. It's a kind of delicious irony that what happened in Hispania ended up as an inversion of what happened famously in Britain in the previous century. There, the remaining Romano-British sought help from the Saxons to keep themselves safe from more local strife and raiders, and the barbarians ended up ruling the island. In Hispania, the barbarian kings sought imperial help in ending their internal strife, and the imperials wound up staying and setting up shop. Because that is what happened. Agila lost a battle and retreated, though it's not clear against whom he was fighting in that battle. Agila's supporters, then, feeling that continued conflict would only lead to more destruction and probably Byzantine domination, killed him and recognized Athanagild as their king. I guess you can't really be called a supporter anymore once you've done that, but whatever. If the goal of the murder was to prevent Byzantine occupation and dominion, then it was a wasted effort. In spite of the efforts of Athanagild to get them to leave, the Byzantine troops stayed right where they were and set up garrisons. Those Byzantines, once they show up, man, getting rid of them is just always going to be a struggle. They're just like buckthorn, for my fellow Midwesterners who know my pain. Imperial sovereignty stretched over a stretch of southern Hispania, more or less consistent with the province of Baetica, which is more or less consistent with modern Andalusia. The Romans named this new administrative unit Provincia Spaniae, finally dropping the H. Over the years, this would expand and contract as stronger and weaker Visigoth kings sought to win back what had been given away. Low-level conflict along the border would ebb and flow, and really the Eastern Empire never really put too much effort into the province in terms of attention or resources, especially after Justinian died. Spania was a long way away, and there were other challenges closer at home. Religious controversy, the ever-present threat of Persia, nomads from the steppes. It was probably mostly thought of as a buffer for the richer African provinces, to protect them from raids or attacks by the Visigoths in imitation of the Vandals, and in that sense the Roman strategy was successful, as no such attack ever took place. So, at the end of this shortish episode, we have the Visigoths now sandwiched between two problems, with the Franks in the north and the Romans in the south. And yet they stand on the cusp of a quite remarkable political and cultural comeback. The Visigothic kingdom in these 50 years has passed through phases of defeat, foreign dominion, and internal strife. While I've mostly spoken of Hispania in all of this time, the center of the kingdom really probably still remain the mostly urban and heavily Romanized coastal territories, from the Rhone to Barcelona, though gravity has been steadily pulling the focus southward. The king we finally landed on today, Athanagild, had no sons, and so the Visigoths looked set for another round of civil war over succession. That sounds a bit tiresome. So before I talk about that, we're going to talk instead about Athanagild's daughters. It will give us an opportunity for some of the interpersonal drama and gossip that has been missing from these last few episodes of battles and successions one after another, and will also give us a look-in on goings-on up there in Francia with all of those brothers and their weirdness, without losing too much focus on the Visigoths. Now that sounds like a bit of a narrative nightmare that I have set for myself now that I say it out loud, but hey, I enjoy a challenge every now and then. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have enjoyed it, reviews and comments are very much appreciated. It just in the last few weeks became possible for me to reply to comments on Spotify, so that's exciting. I probably won't answer every single one, but the possibility for more in-depth conversations is exciting, since I clearly don't know what to do with Facebook. If anybody has any ideas about that, I am open to hearing them. Anyway, until next time, take care.